one of the things that I've noticed, especially with the Victorian state election last year, that a lot of the candidates were male, and there didn't seem to be any form of structural process to help rectify that. In fact, whilst most of the elected members, there's a minimum of, there's a rough 50-50 balance, which is wonderful. The candidates, at least within the Victorian state election, there was a definite bias towards men. Now, I understand that the things that your party structures do seem to rely on these ad hoc mechanisms that you're talking about. People bringing meals, people suggesting, being more supportive, generally having that in mind, which is wonderful. But when we're talking about systemic and structural disadvantage, the type of disadvantage that we're trying to legislate to fix within our whole society, is that ad hoc form of support really enough to adequately support our female politicians?
Look, that's a really good question and a good point. And I guess we've relied on our track record of having more women than men elected to effectively feel like we're addressing those issues adequately because, the proof's been in the pudding. But it's interesting that you say that our candidate ratio, as opposed to our elected member ratio, wasn't a 50-50 balance. And recalling now our most recent Queensland election earlier in 2015, we actually didn't have a gender balance there either. So clearly we need to turn our minds to perhaps a more structured way of ensuring gender balance. Many of our strong female leaders within the party who have some level of influence over pre-selections, although our local members have the final say, I know many of those, and myself included, always try to favour female candidates so that we can have equal representation that we put to the public. Perhaps, as you say, it's time for us to get a little bit more formal about those approaches. I guess it's different for we Greens because our membership is quite powerful and we're driven in a grassroots way when it comes to pre-selections. Some of the other parties have a more sort of top-down approach and therefore they are more amenable to having rules and criteria that might guide their decisions. But certainly that's no excuse, and I think if we don't have a 50-50 candidate representation that we put forward, then we do need to look at our processes and see if we can improve those to make sure that we are addressing those issues more formally.
Sure. Well, that's wonderful to hear that that's definitely top of mind. Look, before we go, Larissa, it would be really wonderful to hear for you if you had the opportunity to implement 3 pieces of legislation to support women and gender and trying to fix gender inequity problems within our society. What would be the 3 top pieces of legislation?
It's so hard to just pick 3. The first one would have to be better addressing domestic and family violence. And that is obviously an incredibly complex policy area with multiple recommendations that would flow from that. The first would be to better resource community legal centres and the legal system and to stop it being stacked against women accessing and receiving justice. And as part and parcel of that, providing the housing services so that women have somewhere to go, because time and time again we're told that women have to choose between violence and homelessness. And what sort of a choice is that in this day and age for anyone? So fixing those legal and housing services, but also addressing those underlying gender inequality attitudes which persist, I would put as number 1 to try and turn around and ultimately eliminate the scourge of domestic violence that Australian women and children, for that matter, are facing. I guess in terms of workforce participation, one of the big barriers is, of course, the availability of affordable and accessible childcare. And it looks like there'll be some policy announcements coming in that space from some of the other parties as the months roll out and perhaps in the lead up to the next federal election. We welcome that. It's good that there's finally some focus on this because clearly that's one of the key barriers to women going back into the workforce. And that links in with women's financial independence. And we know that when it comes to retirement, because women have taken time out of the workforce for child rearing, because there's a gender pay gap and frequently because they're in professions that are paid less and valued less than the male-dominated professions. There's a massive gap in wealth when it comes to retirement and superannuation. So really addressing that financial independence for women through childcare and enabling women to get back into the workforce, and then better valuing those female-dominated parts of the workforce, those professions, I would think would be a good workplace reform. And thirdly, I would either, if I had to pick 3 and not 4, I would have to choose between fixing the gender pay gap, which is just unbelievably inequitable, and it's up to it's about 19% now. It's gotten worse in the last year than it has been in the last 2 decades. Fixing that, because there is absolutely no justification for us to have a gender pay gap. Or it'd be quotas for women in Parliament and on boards, because, as I said before, you need women to break that glass ceiling and to pave the way for women to come. I've benefited from that personally, and I think the Parliament and those companies would really benefit from more female perspectives and ways of conducting themselves, and lateral thinking and general presence. So if I had to pick those ones, I'd sneak in a 4th one there.
What would you say to the critics who would call such quotas positive discrimination?
Well, while we have inequality, you need positive discrimination. Affirmative action is needed so that we can reach equality. That's why affirmative action programs are exempt from our sex discrimination laws, because it's realised that you need those to overcome an underlying inequity and inequality. So I'm all for affirmative action until such time as we finally get gender equality. I can't believe we're not there yet. It's to our eternal discredit as a society that we're still fighting these battles decades and centuries on. I would like to think that we're getting close to reaching full equality, and that in my lifetime we will get there, because the alternative is just horrific. So affirmative action is very much part of that, and I'm a strong supporter of it, and therefore of quotas as well, as one form of affirmative action.
So in a sense, while we're facing structural inequality, whether it be women not being represented in Parliament, in boards, there is an argument to say that a more qualified man could or should miss out for a woman who may or may not be as qualified.
Well, I think that you'll find actually that there are more than enough women who are adequately qualified, and that women can succeed on merit, but frequently they're overlooked for those reasons unrelated to their ability, like, oh, she might go off and have kids and then I'll have to find someone to step in for her. That kind of subtle, almost sometimes even unrecognised discrimination. That's why those gender reporting requirements have been so useful, because the feedback we've heard is that many of the folk in those senior ranks, and most of them are men, have thought that their company didn't have a problem and didn't have a gender pay gap. And once they've done, inputted the data and gotten their report back, they've realised, oh, okay, I do. And that's been the first step in them then wanting to tackle and fix those problems. So there's a lot of, subconscious discrimination. And so I think we can, as I say, I think we can have affirmative action and we can have quotas, and there will be more than enough women who are meritorious and more than capable of fulfilling those roles.
So if I understood you correctly, and we've gone off a little off topic, but I love this line of questioning. If I've understood you correctly, the gender reporting reforms put in by the Labor government have actually created a context in which business leaders are currently now identifying and seeing for the first time a form of structural disadvantage or discrimination that they didn't even realise existed.
Yeah, and that's been part of their success story. We've questioned through Senate estimates the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, who are the folk that administer these reporting requirements, and that's precisely the feedback that they've been sharing with us, that CEOs thought that their company was fine and recognised that there was a gender pay gap in society, but didn't think their company had a gender pay gap, and they've actually learned that they have. And they're then starting to take the steps to address that. So there's been that really good cultural change driver in revealing the gender pay gap, and not just sort of in the abstract, but in the specific. So that's all part of trying to fix this notion that women and men shouldn't be paid the same and that their work that they do shouldn't be valued equally.
So it's the old idiom, what gets measured gets fixed.
Look, that's exactly right, and the fact that the Abbott government has sought to water down those reporting requirements has been extremely foolish and confronting, because you can't fix the gender pay gap by hiding it. You need to shine that light on it and to learn the full extent and scope of it in order to be able to properly address it. So it's a long and complicated story. They were due to increase the reporting requirements, and the Abbott government put a freeze on that increase for 12 months. They then undertook a review, and they didn't look at just the additional requirements that were scheduled to come in that they delayed. They also looked at the existing requirements, and we feared that they would take a huge axe to the whole notion of gender pay reporting because of their deregulation agenda and belief that gender reporting is just red tape rather than affirmative action and much necessary data gathering to address a real problem. I was actually relieved that they have only taken a small axe and not a big axe to those reporting requirements. They have dropped some, and they haven't brought in all of the new ones that were scheduled to come in, but it's a better position than I was fearing. And I welcome the fact that many of the businesses that have participated in the data gathering so far have become champions for that reporting and have said that not only has this helped them identify discrimination in their own workplaces, but that they actually think that it's a positive thing for the sector broadly to be gathering this data. So there's been some real positives forward, even though the Abbott government looked like it was going to massively undermine things for a while there. They have weakened the requirements, but they have left intact the fundamental infrastructure, and I think in years to come those requirements will be strengthened again, and business will welcome that.
And so the businesses with whom you've been speaking to who have reported saying that the financial imposition on meeting these reporting requirements are not too burdensome, they're not undermining the economic productivity of our society?
Look, it really depended on which businesses were responding. Some of the much larger businesses had some concerns about some of the data that they were going to have to start collecting, and then the Abbott government said, don't worry about it, you don't have to start collecting that, like applications, like who is applying for jobs and who is getting interviews. Some of the really large employers were saying that they thought that was going to be a real impost on them financially, and of course the Abbott government therefore buckled because it does whatever big business wants. But some of the other employers were saying, actually, we kind of gather this data anyway, we've just never sort of thought to put it in the one place and then generate a report that tells us, do we have a problem with gender pay gap or not? So there were a variety of views. I don't want to misrepresent people there, but there was certainly enough business that was supportive of the concept that we still have those reporting requirements, albeit in diluted form.
That's really interesting and valuable to hear, the fact that many businesses were so supportive that the Abbott government didn't have too much pressure to completely wipe them out. Certainly having good statistics to understand any form of disadvantage that women face is really key to us as feminists making strides towards fixing this. Look, Larissa, thank you so much for joining us on the F Word. It's been fabulous interviewing you. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for the work that you've been doing.
Well, thank you, and good luck with your project. I think it's super exciting, and as a proud feminist and happy to say so, I'm thrilled to help, and well done shining a light on these issues, because we will get there, and it's thanks to folk like you that we will.
Look forward to hearing some of the structural programs that you put forward from within the party.
I do too.
All right, thanks, Larissa.
Bye.
Bye.